How do you know that you have a fair culture?
Well, it comes back down to the experiences of those who are engaging with your organization, on those who make your organization.
I'm hearing you say you need to check in with your team. You have to have open dialogue and understand what they are perceiving.
Fairness doesn't necessarily mean equal.
You've got to actually look at it and assess whether or not the practices are unfair.
Maybe you don't have the means to give everybody a raise.
If someone feels like this is unfair, let's first ask, is it?
Even if you're not in a management team, how are you showing up? Because some people have their own preferences.
Something that leaders have to deal with is
employees could become very cynical if they feel like their experience is unfair. And once that cynicism starts driving their work, it compromises a lot of different things. Their personality, their character, their attitude, and more importantly, their production.
Welcome to the Workforce Success Podcast, brought to you by Mwano Consultancy. I'm Andrea, and this is Deo. How you doing today, Deo?
Hello, Andrea. How you doing?
Doing well. We're here to share with you some of the insights that we have from working with various partners in the consulting work that we do, and offer you some helpful and relevant tips and solutions to improve the culture of your organization. And today we are unpacking one of our 7 principles, fairness. So to get started, Deo, could you talk a little bit about the definition of fairness, how we think about fairness in the context of workforce culture, and why it matters to pay attention to the level of integrity and fairness that's happening within your organization?
Yeah, fairness is a really important thing within an organization because employees are reflecting on their experience holistically, and at times they are sizing up to see where they feel certain things is benefiting them, where they feel certain things is not benefiting them. And the way that we define fairness in our work is it's about looking at how accessibility, transparency to the resources that are provided within an organization or experiences, and how is it being distributed across all the employees that are represented. And so part of our work is to really help organizations, businesses to be very intentional in how they look at fairness. And when we're talking about fairness, at times it might be equality, and at times it actually might be equity. Because depending on where folks are, their situation, their team dynamic, who they are, what they bring within the work environment, it will require different types of resources in order for them to be successful. At the end of the day, it's really about how are folks getting to the end goal? Either the end goal based on what they get by being an employee of a certain organization, or the end goal in terms of what they're asked to do on a daily basis in terms of their deliverables.
Some people think that treating everyone fairly means treating everyone equally. And if someone's being treated indifferently than someone else, depending on the circumstance, is that unfair? What would you say to that?
Fairness doesn't necessarily mean equal, because there's different things that are occurring from an operational standpoint. There's also different things that people need in order for them to be successful as employees. So I would caution folks to not think about fairness as equal. There are times where you can have things in place that's more transparent and equally spread out for everyone. But then there's also times where things have to be customized based on who the individuals are. In a lot of our work, in our culture and climate work, we're looking at everyone that makes up an organization, the identity they bring, their skill set, their abilities, right? And making sure that the employer has the right means of distribution and consideration of what those experiences are in order to provide the right tools and resources for those employees to be successful. So I would say fairness can be equal. Fairness can also be equitable.
How do you know that you have a fair culture and a fair practice within your organization?
Well, it comes back down to the experiences of those who are engaging with your organization, on those who make your organization. There are certain things that are you disclose transparently around certain experiences. For instance, you might have an organization that has different shifts, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe the employees that work during the day, they have a little bit more visibility or consideration because maybe 75% of the entire workforce is actually the team that's there during the day. And the incentives in the gathering or the culture building experience that employees might have, it might be catered a lot more towards the first shift employees versus the second and third shift. So part of that is some folks might just cater those activities or resources specifically to those who are in the first shift and not consider second or third. And then it gets disclosed and introduced to everybody the same way. And then the second shift folks are saying, well, I can't do this or I can't do that. It doesn't seem like I was accounted for, or I have to come in during the day for certain things. So that's why it's really important to be able to reflect on that and try to figure out what are the moving parts of your organization and is everybody accounted for? So the one that I just gave an examples in regards is to shifts. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it might be operation. I was working with, a couple of years ago, I was working with this organization where they were managing a bunch of different properties, and each property had a different business model in terms of how the company got compensated for their work. With that came with different preservation in terms of what those buildings, the folks that worked for those buildings can get versus others. But for the employee experience, the entire experience was to them, they just knew that I work for this organization and this is what we do. Mm-hmm. And they would look out and they saw that there was some unfairness in terms of how certain employees were being treated that worked at different buildings. But what they didn't know was the business model is very different from one building to another, depending on the board dynamic, depending on luxury or non-luxury. So all the employees knew that what they saw visibly in terms of the experiences other employees had that managed different properties was completely different than theirs. So it's really important as an employer to be able to reflect on that, right? And being transparent in terms of how do you think about your resource allocation. Mm-hmm. So I gave an example around shifts. That's per individual, but now I just gave an example around different business practices. And sometimes it might even equate to different clientele that you have, right? You might have a clientele that's willing to maybe pay extra for different things. So the team will cater to them differently than versus others. So let's say you are an account manager of a team that's working with a partner that might not have all the bells and whistles, mm-hmm. but you see all your partners that have all the bells and whistles. You know, maybe they're being flown out to see the partner in first class or maybe even a private jet. Never know. I've had partners that have done stuff like that. And then you're looking out, you're like, wow, like I'm getting a Greyhound bus for 12 hours to get there. That's just an exaggeration, but I'm not trying to talk badly about Greyhound, by the way, too. But, you know, so like there's a lot of that stuff. So you're looking out, all you know is like you feel like your experience is less favorable than some other employees. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden it starts impacting you. You're like, well, I feel like I'm not being treated fairly. That's why it's important as an employer to really, really reflect on that. Yes, the business drivers might determine the experience, but it's still on you to be able to disclose it. And it's also very important to look at ways that you can equitably distribute the resources or the experience in order to ensure that your employees on the receiving end can experience that. And then if you can't, just be able to disclose it. Maybe some folks like working with those partners that bring in less revenue, but maybe the pace is more at ease. Maybe those are the type of account manager to manage that. But if the bonus structure is different, so to me, I think it's really about that transparency in order to disclose what the business priority is being driven by.
Obviously, remote work has been around for a while, but COVID really put that in the forefront where many people were forced to figure out how to operate remotely. And then once people were able to come back into the offices, there were usually some version of hybrids or some roles stayed remote or some mixture of things. And then you would have some folks that were required to stay on site at whatever the company was. And sometimes you'll hear folks say, well, it's not fair that we can't work remotely and other people get to work remotely. And that is sometimes perceived as an inequity or something, an unfair practice.
Or they feel that they work harder because they're working on physically versus the ones that are remotely.
Yeah, so there's a lot of dynamics that you could put under the bucket of, is this fair or unfair in remote work versus on-site work. And sometimes folks that work remotely feel that it can be unfair, that there's some common assumptions that are made of remote workers that are negative, actually. So someone might look at being able to work remotely as a perk, whereas others who work remotely and maybe experience higher levels of oversight, or there's monitoring of people's activities, or sometimes there's mistrust of folks that are working remotely and you assume they're sitting in their pajamas and they're not really working. There's a lot that can go into it, but to go back to that initial example of, I have to work on site and someone else gets to work remotely, that's unfair. I think a remedy to that, or something to unpack there, if that's something that your organization is dealing with, would be to look at the core needs of the role and just that transparent communication that you mentioned, to explain to people and that the core function of their role. If you have a job that has to be done at a certain location, then you have to be at that location to do that job. But if the core functionality of the role is something that can be reasonably achieved remotely, then that might be something as an organization you could look at and say, well, maybe there's elements of this role that could be, maybe there's a hybrid opportunity if that's something that people want to do. But sometimes it's not actually fair when you talk through with people the reason behind why one job needs to be based in a certain location versus another can be remotely. So that perception matters as much as the analysis of, the practice itself. I think it would be fair for organizations to ask themselves, if someone feels like this is unfair, let's first ask, is it? Right? And then if you feel confident about the reasons why you've made certain operational choices, then it becomes a matter of communicating those transparently to people and maybe working together to figure out what needs they have, that aren't met. Could you talk a little bit about, if you're a manager, sometimes we see when we work with certain partners and we're working with leaders in an organization, sometimes they're dealing with, along the same lines of that, perceived unfairness. What's really unfair versus when someone feels like something is unfair. Something that leaders have to deal with is when you have a team working together and they can see some of their coworkers maybe breaking a policy, or maybe they're calling out a lot, or they're maybe unkind or rude or disruptive to the team, and they're like, why? They don't see any disciplinary action happening. And they'll complain to a supervisor, or they'll gossip that, this is unfair, this person isn't held accountable and we have to deal with it, or we have to pick up the slack. And as a leader, sometimes we hear the leaders in that situation feel stuck between a rock and a hard place, because they might be involved and aware of some of the conversations that are happening with that employee in terms of performance management or disciplinary action, that their confidentiality, to respect their confidentiality, they can't then go talk about that to their colleagues that might be perceiving some lack of accountability or unfairness. I'm curious, in your experience with our partners, what are some, if there's someone feeling kind of stuck in that conundrum, what can you do so that all of your employees trust that fair practices are happening while still respecting the confidentiality of the other employee?
I always say in our work that it's really important as a leader, so you can be a supervisor, manager, director, executive, whatever your title is, to consider the perception of your team. I would say even beyond consider, it has to be in the forefront, because regardless if it's true or not in how you evaluate it, it gives you insights of how people feel about their experience around that particular thing. And if you're not intentional to do that, then you're not going to really know how your employees feel about their experience. So first, I would say definitely gauge with your employees in order to really figure out how they feel about certain things. And if it has to do with fairness, you have to be able to ask and ask it in different ways and use different tools. And what you take from that will inform you on their perspective and point of views around that particular thing. Do not take it for granted or bypass it because you know the truth. So you're like, why do they feel this way? This is so. It gives you the insight that you need to figure out what do you need to do in order to level set, in order to be able to share information transparently so they know what's playing. Because at the end of the day, especially when it comes to fairness, there's a lot of stuff tied to fairness, right? It might be compensation, it might be workload, a whole lot of things. It's really important because it's a lot of time it's the bottom line, and employees could become very cynical if they feel like their experience is unfair. And once that cynicism starts driving their work, it compromises a lot of different things: their personality, their character, their attitude, and more importantly, their production. So I would say it's really important to be able to capture it. Mm-hmm. And then when you capture it, then you got to figure out what part of this interpretation or perception that we're missing as an organization in terms of helping our employees to fully understand what's happening. And as you unpack it, if you do come across certain things where you've realized it's on you or your organization to address, don't bypass it and use the reason why you haven't done this or the organization hasn't done that or this in order to justify that thing to not exist. Mm-hmm. Because if you can identify the gap, then you have to figure out how do you solve that particular thing, because it's really, really important to be able to address it, right? Maybe you don't have the means to give everybody a raise or that perks. Mm-hmm. Well, what can you do? Are there a goal that the organization can meet, and in result of that goal that can transfer and translate into more equitable wages or equitable bonuses? And that could even be around tools that the teams are using if they need better tools to do their work, right? That transparent, it's so important because you can come back and say, hey, the reason why we haven't been able to do this is because of this, or the reason why this is happening or that. But if you also reflect and find that you do have the means and it's hard for you to just disattach, then it's on you. Mm-hmm. And then you also have to take ownership to see what the potential negative consequences could be around not addressing the areas where folks feel that your organization is unequitable or unfair. Because if you don't watch it carefully, it might be the area where you might lose customers or lose employees, because eventually they're just going to become fed up and they're going to leave your organization. And right. Nowadays, if you need your employees, you don't want to contribute to the possibility of them leaving your organization, because finding other folks to replace them will cost a lot of money. So right. I would definitely say that you have to definitely take ownership in making sure that you're addressing the areas where people feel like things are unfair.
Right. So definitely, I'm hearing you say you need to check in with your team. You have to have open dialogue and understand what they are perceiving and how fair they feel the practices of the organization or you as a leader are. And then when you identify potential areas where they're unhappy or they feel like there's unfairness, you've got to actually look at it and assess whether or not the practices are unfair. And if they are, let's go back and communicate why things are the way they are, get on the same page. If there's not, then you have to remedy that. The advice that I've given leaders that we work with is to just not be afraid of the conversation that you need to have. And if there's something that you cannot disclose to them, whether it's because, there's confidentiality because of performance management issues that you shouldn't be discussing, or sometimes it's medical issues or accommodations that people receive, you can say, there's some things that I am not permitted to share with you, and I'm going to need you to trust the process a little bit on this one. And another thing to look at is, are the behaviors changing because of feedback from those employees that say this problematic behavior continues? That might be an indication that the performance improvement measures aren't happening, right? But I think it's like, if you're a leader and you feel like someone has a perception of unfairness that really isn't valid, in the sense that you've assessed the situation and everything is above board and appropriate, then you have to maybe tell them, like, there are some things that I can't share with you, but I need you to know that the process is being followed with this. So if you, to kind of look forward towards, we've unpacked a little bit about why does fairness matter? What are some examples of unfair practices? The idea of like how people perceive things and getting temperature checks on that. If someone listening to this podcast is curious about assessing their level of fairness in their organization and how to improve things, I'm curious to talk a little bit about the different elements that can go into that. So first, how do you think that policies can support a fair culture?
I think policies are super important because policies provide guardrails or a way of operating, right? It streamlines certain processes, and your policy is supposed to reflect who you are and who you want to be. And it's supposed to create, it's a backbone, right? It's a foundation that folks use as a reference. So if your policy does not reflect a fairness approach, then you're at a deficit. There's nothing to use as a reference. And part of it is that you don't predetermine or pre-create the policy without matching it to the reality of the everyday experience of your employees. I think it goes hand to hand. You have to be able to understand the lens in which you are looking at to inform who you want to be. Because if it has to be a value too, right? Like, so we can't just assume that every organization wants to be fair, right? Like some organizations, there might be certain areas where it's like, it'd be great. And with this area, yes, but with this area, it's really about, we're a business. We need to make money. We need to make sure our customers are satisfied, right? So sometimes there might be certain areas where businesses might compromise in terms of, that doesn't really matter. Yeah, that's in this area. But the reality is, I always say you have to be able to reflect and look at where the touch points of the employee experiences are in order to determine who you need to be. And as an effective organization that reflects the experiences of their internal team will always gauge their employees in order to figure out areas where they need to approve and assess. And so if it's a value, then you're throwing it against the wall at all times in order to see, are we fair here? Are we fair here? Are we fair here? How is it playing out for this group? How is it playing out for this group? What is it looking like for this person? And it's really important because it's iterative. It's always gonna be a work in progress. There's not a perfect organization out there, right? Mm-hmm. Every organization needs improvement, especially when it has to do with people, because people are always going to be unsatisfied on times, right? It depends on the season. It depends on what's happening. But if that's something that you're in charge of, you always have to reflect on that, because it's a really important part of the way that folks see themselves within an organization. And I would say that you want to have some matrix and barometer that you measure how equitable or how fair are you in your areas of focus and areas of concentration. You want to be explicit. You want to be able to name it. So for us, in a lot of the work that we do, sometimes it might be on the wage side. Sometimes it might be on the professional development side. Sometimes it might be on the policy, meaning like if there's some infraction or how people are being recognized. But you got to look at it in all the buckets, especially when it comes to your employee experience, in order to name it. Mm-hmm. Are we fair in this? Are we fair? And then you segment your questions and your inquiries to make sure that folks are reflecting on each one of the buckets that's most critical when they think about their existence or their collaboration within your organization. I think that's where it starts. And as you learn along the way, then you make the proper changes. And if you care about your team, then you definitely want to care about being a fair organization, because it goes a long way. And if you have mid-level managers or senior management team that might not value this, then they might not be the right person or the right people to be in your team if it's not going to trickle back down.
Right.
And part of it is even when you're bringing in new folks in, you want to be intentional. We've been working with certain organizations where we've actually been very, very hands-on in some of their onboarding strategies, because the leadership team has recognized that what we've been building is so critical that when people come in, that they're already coming into understanding their core values. And we always use the 7 principle with different organizations we work with. They have their own definitions of what those principles are. And so part of it's like, how are you going to show up in order to show that you are a fair supervisor or a fair director or a fair manager? Or even if you're not in a management team, how are you showing up every day in order for your team to know that you're fair, right? Because some people have their own preferences. You know, you might treat one person another way, you might treat another person another way. And the colleagues, they will report on that. So anyways, I know I kind of went full circle on that, but I do think that in our work, we try to take these conceptual ideas and principles that are so great, like fair and dependability, consideration. We try to take it from the mission statement and the vision statement into action, because these principles live and breathe on a daily basis, either on a positive side where people are demonstrating, or on the deficit side where people are not demonstrating it, but it still impacts the employees. So fairness is a big one. It's a huge one. It's a huge one because it's tied to so many different things. So
yeah, that was really holistic, because we started with policies, but you really touched on how you need to have policies, practices, and a system in place that is intentionally tied to the values and the culture that you want to create. But you also need the people operating within that system that share those core values and are aligned on those values. And it's the people that ultimately hold accountability for the system and are operating and are creating the real experiences for the other people within your organization.
100%. And sometimes we ask our partner and we say, oh, that sounds great, but do you have the capacity right now, to ensure that this is occurring? And it's a hard question to ask sometimes, and sometimes it's rhetorical, because we, like, based on what we've done, we know that they're not there yet, but we want them to reflect on it to see if they're thinking about it from an implementation standpoint. So they might say, oh, actually, yeah, you're right, we're not ready yet. So then I say, what does it look like for you to build capacity to then be that, right? In an area where you're unsure. And then it might, if they're still willing and they think it's important, then we might create a strategy for them and what that looks like. And again, we operate a lot through pilots. So again, we're at the forefront. So we come in the front end where we might do an assessment and create an information gathering model where we're using qualitative and quantitative data, and we pinpoint on certain areas. And then when it comes to implementation, we might help in the strategy. And sometimes with some of our partners, we're actually asked to implement through a pilot. So something like fairness, we might pick 2 things. We might say, we're looking at upskilling and professional development. How often are you going internally for candidates when positions are available? Or how often are you going externally, right? So that's when the rubber hits the road, because the reality is you can go back into your HR system. Even if you don't have an HR system, you can literally say, in the last year, how many hires did we have? Were they internal or were they external, right? And then part of it, you also look at longevity. How long has your team, because a lot of times, that's where some gaps might occur, right? Or where, if it's a larger organization where there's different department, maybe people are being promoted in different departments when they get those positions. You're really looking at the data to say, okay, what does that look like? Because sometimes we might hear from the employees, hey, I've reached peak here. You know, like I've seen my colleague, actually, I see a lot of external candidate that comes in. They don't care about that. They don't care about us. They only care about us to deliver what our role is right now. But they don't care about us when it comes to promotion, because all we see is the people that are getting promoted are external people that are coming in, right? So with that scenario, I say, let's go to your data, right? And so that's what I was saying earlier. When the rubber hits the road, a lot of the organization, they're afraid to see that data in its face value. When I would say something like, let's look at who's been promoted in the last 12 months, right? Because so then some have gone through the exercise, so they would look at the things, and then we'll say, what are the skill set that's allowed folks internally to move on to the next level? Or what are the skill set of the external candidates that you hired that was different than the internal candidate? Because it seems like there's a gap here, right? If people are staying here for a long period of time, and when promotion opportunities coming up, they're not getting promoted, then it seems like there's a missed opportunity. People are not getting the proper development and skill set to obtain those new roles, right? So I know the examples like really to the nitty gritty of it, but those are some areas where we see often in some of our partners. So then we ask, what is it? Well, we can't forecast, right? Some position, it's really hard. There's only a small slot for a manager or a director level. So when people leave, it might be that, it might be a medical thing, or it might be it just happened. And then we have, 15 people internally that potentially want to get the position, and we don't really have a merit. So again, this is a behind the scene conversation, right? So some partners are transparent with us. We realize we don't really have anything robust for our internal team to move to the next, and then we don't really have time. We want to fill the spot. It's much easier to just go externally and try to find someone, right? I've had partners that have said that to me at times. I don't have any judgment towards them, but it just shows the gap, right? That's a big gap. Like if someone's been around for 12, 15 years and they're ready for the next, they're pursuing the next opportunity, and they can't get the next opportunity because they were never upskilled properly, or you just don't want the internal drama of like, oh, we picked Susie, or we picked Mark, or we picked Jonathan, or whoever the person is, and you're afraid that it might create some discrepancy, so therefore it's much easier to go for an outside candidate. Like I've had partners that have said that to me after unpacking. It doesn't happen right away. After unpacking, like you're trying to figure out like, what's the root cause? Like, yeah, we were afraid for the internal discrepancy in my cause if we promoted someone internally, because we don't have a really robust upskilling process or a merit system that we can come back and say, oh, this person got the job because of this. So we just go with the external candidate.
I think that's interesting to just name something that because in our work, we do a lot of unpacking and try to do root cause analysis and put the puzzle pieces together to make recommendations and help people find solutions. And a lot of that was a very specific issue, but something I think we could generalize a theme is that sometimes there's another problem or a fear that they just they don't look at, and they go over here and they do something else, and I guess to kind of wrap up and put, bring a really key takeaway from everything I've heard you share is that for leaders to ensure that there is a fairness permeating through their culture, you have to be willing to look at the problems that you have, which is uncomfortable. And you have to be willing to deal with the challenges or the things you might be falling short on, or the problem that might come with a more equitable professional development practice. If you don't want to deal with some of the added work that would require, you're gonna have problems down the line. So be willing to turn and look at the challenges within your organization and unpack a little bit to find the right problem to solve and make sure you're coming up with the right solutions. Be willing to ask your employees how they feel about their culture and if they do feel things are fair, because that will give you an idea about where to shine a flashlight, so to speak, on what to look further into. So I would say it sounds like, would you agree with that? I don't know if that's my takeaway or a theme that I'm hearing in some of the answers that you've shared or the anecdotes, is the process of introspection and looking within at what's actually playing out and why, so that you can come up with the right solutions.
100%. I definitely agree with you.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Deo. Thank you for joining us today as we talked about fairness in the workplace. If you found this information relevant and helpful, please subscribe for more content from us and share with a colleague.
Thank you, Andrea.